Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the first-class line at San Francisco International Airport, his worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Amidst the flashing luxury and restless energy of the terminal, he was a calm, almost unnoticeable presence. But then came an unexpected twist, a torn ticket, an airline clerk with a chip on her shoulder, and a moment that left an entire plane speechless. What happened next would change one woman's life in ways she never saw coming. Before we dive into this whirlwind of a story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you love gripping tales like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we have another jaw-dropping story lined up just for you. Now, let's get into it. Keanu Reeves was no stranger to fame, but he'd spent years perfecting the art of blending in. Unlike other Hollywood elites who paraded around with entourages and expected VIP treatment, Keanu was different. He carried his own bags, stood in line like everyone else, and struck up conversations with strangers as if he weren't one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Fame hadn't inflated his ego, it had only made him more grounded. That day, he was at San Francisco Airport, preparing for a flight to Osaka, Japan, where he'd soon be filming his next action movie. His assistant had insisted on booking him a first-class ticket, an indulgence he rarely allowed himself. Keanu wasn't one for luxury, he'd spent most of his life flying coach, squeezed into middle seats, chatting with whoever happened to be sitting beside him. But this time, he'd given in. A long-haul flight deserved a little comfort. Or so he thought. As he approached the first-class check-in counter, his duffel bag resting easily on his shoulder, he noticed a tension in the air. Something felt off. Behind the counter stood Clara Hensley, an airline clerk whose crisp uniform was as rigid as the expression on her face. Her brown hair was pulled into a severe bun, her name tag gleaming under the bright airport lights. But her demeanor? All business. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her movements sharp and impatient. She didn't even glance up when Keanu stepped forward. Instead, she barked out a curt, "First-class passengers only." Her tone was flat, dismissive, like she'd repeated those words 1,000 times and resented every single one. Keanu responded with a polite smile, the kind that usually put people at ease, and slid his boarding pass across the counter. "I'm flying first class," he said, his voice calm, steady. He expected a quick scan and a nod. Instead, Clara snatched the ticket up, barely glancing at it before her lips curled into a skeptical smirk. "This has to be a mistake," she scoffed, her tone dripping with doubt. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowing. "I don't think so. That's my seat." He wasn't offended, at least, not yet. Just confused. Clara exhaled sharply, shaking her head like she was dealing with a child trying to pull a fast one. "Sorry, but we're not allowing upgrades or freebies into first class today. This section is reserved for paying elite passengers." Her words were clipped, her tone final, as if she'd already decided he didn't belong. Keanu, still composed, raised an eyebrow. "I am a paying passenger." He didn't argue. Didn't throw around his celebrity status. He never did. But Clara wasn't buying it. She let out a dry, condescending laugh, the kind that cuts deeper than it should. "With all due respect, sir, I seriously doubt that." Her gaze flicked over him, his scuffed boots, his well-worn jacket, as if she were sizing up a fraud. And then, she did the unthinkable. With a deliberate, almost theatrical motion, she gripped his boarding pass between her manicured fingers and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper cut through the air like a gunshot. For a moment, silence fell over the terminal. Keanu's eyes flickered to the shredded remnants of his ticket as they fluttered onto the counter. His face remained unreadable, but something in his expression shifted. A woman nearby gasped, clutching her phone. Did she just, she whispered to her friend, who nodded, wide-eyed. "That's Keanu Reeves," another voice hissed. Recognition rippled through the growing crowd behind him. Clara, unfazed, crossed her arms, her chin lifting defiantly. "If you want to fly with us, buy a ticket like everyone else." For the first time, Keanu let out a quiet chuckle. Not amused, just incredulous. He wasn't one to demand special treatment, never the type to pull a "do you know who I am" card. He'd faced far worse in his life and walked away unscathed. But this? This was something else. Nearby, a younger airline staff member named Jake hovered nervously. His face had gone pale as he watched the scene unfold. "Clara," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think you just made a huge mistake." She shot him a sharp look. "If he has a problem, he can take it up with someone else. I'm doing my job." Keanu inhaled deeply, grounding himself. "I don't want trouble," he said evenly. "But maybe you should double-check before tearing up someone's ticket." Clara's smirk deepened. She leaned forward slightly and whispered, "And maybe you should stop pretending you belong where you don't." Then, with a flick of her wrist, she called out, "Next in line." Like he was nothing. The murmurs grew louder. Phones were coming out. Whispers turned into a buzz. Keanu stood there, the torn ticket at his feet, knowing one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The remnants of his boarding pass lay scattered across the counter like the opening move in a battle neither of them saw coming. And Clara Hensley? She had no idea just how badly she had messed up. The murmur in the airport grew into a full-blown commotion. More people stopped in their tracks, drawn by the crackling tension in the air. "That's Keanu Reeves," someone whispered, incredulous. "She just tore up his ticket. Who does she think she is?" another voice hissed. Keanu remained still, his gaze fixed on the shredded pieces of paper before him. His face was composed, but beneath that calm exterior, a storm brewed. He wasn't the type to lose his temper or throw his weight around. He'd been through too much in life to let something like this shake him. But this? This was something else. This was public, raw, and absurdly personal. He parted his lips to speak, maybe to defuse the situation, but Clara beat him to it. "Next in line," she snapped, her voice slicing through the chaos as if she could erase him with sheer will alone. Nearby, the younger staff member, Jake, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his face pale. "Clara, stop," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "That's Keanu Reeves. You just trashed his ticket." She yanked free, shooting him a glare dripping with venom. "I don't care who he thinks he is. He's not sneaking into first class on my watch." The words, loud enough for everyone to hear, sent the crowd into an uproar. "Are you kidding me?" a woman shouted, waving her phone. "He's Keanu freaking Reeves," someone else bellowed. A man in a baseball cap shook his head. "Lady, you're insane." The air buzzed with outrage, people recording from every angle. Keanu, ever the peacemaker, raised a hand in an attempt to dial it back. "Hey, let's just take a breath," he said, his voice steady, the kind that usually calmed a room. But Clara wasn't interested in peace. She leaned over the counter, her eyes burning with something ugly. "Take a breath," she spat. "How about you take a hike? I'm not here to babysit some washed-up actor trying to scam a free ride." The insult landed like a slap, sharp and brutal. The crowd collectively gasped. Keanu blinked, the faintest flicker of something, hurt, crossing his face before he buried it. He wasn't used to this. Not the rudeness, he'd seen his fair share of that, but the venom, the way she had twisted a simple misunderstanding into a personal attack. Before he could say a word, a new voice cut through the noise. "What the hell is going on here?" The tension in the air shifted, the energy crackling anew as heads swiveled toward the source. Sophia Grant, CEO of the airline, strode into the chaos like a force of nature. Tall, poised, exuding quiet authority, she was a stark contrast to the madness unfolding around her. The second her sharp gaze landed on the torn ticket, then flicked to Clara, something dangerous flickered in her expression. "Did you just destroy a passenger's boarding pass?" she asked, her voice low, controlled, but lethal. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, meeting Sophia's gaze with defiance. "Yeah, I did. He's trying to pass off a fake ticket for first class," she said, her words electric, a live wire sparking between them. "I'm not letting some con artist waltz through just because he's got a famous face." Sophia's jaw tightened, but she turned to Keanu, her voice softening. "Mr. Reeves, are you okay? I am so sorry about this." Keanu gave a small nod, still composed. "I'm fine. Just a little confused, I guess." He gestured to the scraps of paper littering the counter. "That was my ticket." Sophia's gaze snapped back to Clara, her patience visibly fraying. "You're telling me you ripped up a valid boarding pass because you didn't believe him?" Clara smirked, unfazed. "Valid? Please. Look at him. Does he scream first-class passenger to you? I'm doing my job, keeping the riffraff out. You should be thanking me." The crowd erupted. "Is she delusional? Fire her." Sophia raised a hand, commanding silence, but Clara wasn't done. She jabbed a finger at Keanu, her voice rising. "And you, quit playing the victim. Everyone knows you're just a has-been clinging to relevance. Go buy a coach ticket and stop wasting my time." The words cut through the air like a blade. This time, Keanu's calm cracked, not in anger, but something quieter. Deeper. A quiet hurt flickered in his expression before he buried it beneath his usual composure. But the onlookers saw. And they didn't like it. "Why is he just standing there?" a guy muttered. "Call her out, man," a woman shouted, pushing closer, phone still recording. "Don't let her talk to you like that." The pressure in the air mounted, thick as a storm cloud. They wanted a fight. They wanted a spectacle, Keanu Reeves versus the rude airline clerk, a viral showdown for the ages. But Keanu? He wouldn't give it to them. "I'm not here to argue," he said softly, almost to himself. "I just wanted to get on the plane." Sophia took a step forward, her voice turning to steel. "Hensley, you've crossed a line." Clara let out a bitter, brittle laugh. "Crossed a line? I'm protecting this airline's standards. You're the one pandering to him just because he's famous. What's next? Free upgrades for every wannabe star? A bold challenge. A reckless one. A direct shot at Sophia's authority." Sophia's eyes flashed dangerously, but she kept her cool. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice deceptively soft. "That ticket was real. Paid for. Personally approved by me. Mr. Reeves is my guest." Clara's smirk faltered, just for a second. But she doubled down. "Your guest?" she scoffed. "Then you're the fool, not me." The crowd held its breath. The air was so thick with tension, it could choke. Sophia leaned in, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You're done calling the shots. Step aside. Now." Clara didn't move. Her defiance was a wall. Keanu watched, caught in the crossfire, as the situation spiraled beyond his control. Hours later, on board the flight to Osaka, the tension from the check-in fiasco still lingered in the air. Keanu settled into his first-class seat, his mind replaying the scene at the airport. A few rows ahead, Sophia sat upright, her posture stiff, her thoughts clearly still on the mess Clara had created. And Clara herself? She was on the plane too. A cruel twist of fate, or a carefully crafted punishment. Demoted from her position, forced to fly as a passenger. She sat just a few rows behind Keanu in business class, arms crossed, her face twisted with resentment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had torn up his ticket now found herself on the same flight, stripped of authority, her pride in tatters. Keanu glanced back, just for a moment. Their eyes met. Clara glared at him, her lips twitching as if she wanted to spit venom. He simply sighed and turned away. This flight was going to be interesting. Took her ages to claw her way back, Sophia continued, her voice quieter now. She finally landed this job, but after that mess, she's had a chip on her shoulder about famous passengers. Thinks they all expect special treatment. Keanu absorbed the words, his gaze flickering toward Clara. She sat stiffly, her fingers gripping the armrests as if holding herself together. The fire that had burned in her earlier had dulled, leaving something else, exhaustion, maybe. She's got a lot to prove, Sophia said, rubbing her temples. To herself. To everyone. But today, she lost sight of the line between doing her job and making it personal. Keanu exhaled through his nose. It made sense now, why Clara had been so relentless, why she'd clung so hard to the idea that he didn't belong. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the ghosts she was still fighting. Doesn't excuse what she did, Sophia added, glancing at him. You handled it with more patience than most would. Keanu offered a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. People carry their past with them. Sometimes, it makes them act out before they even realize why. Sophia studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're a better man than me, Reeves. If someone had torn up my ticket, I wouldn't have been so zen. Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. I wouldn't call it zen. Just, experience. The conversation trailed off, Sophia turning back to her tablet, but the weight of it lingered. Keanu glanced toward business class again. Clara was staring straight ahead, her posture rigid, her mind clearly still spinning. After a beat, as if feeling his gaze, she turned. Their eyes met. No venom this time. No sharp edges. Just a long, uncertain silence. Then, before he could say anything, she looked away. Keanu sighed and leaned back into his seat, closing his eyes. The flight droned on, and the world outside remained dark and endless. Osaka was still hours away. And somehow, despite the altitude, the tension between them remained grounded, waiting. The cool Osaka night greeted Keanu as he stepped out of the terminal. Neon lights shimmered in the distance, casting reflections on rain-slick pavement. He pulled his jacket tighter, fingers brushing against the folded note in his pocket. Clara was gone. The storm had passed. But the ripple effects still lingered. His driver was waiting, a polite nod, a smooth transition into the quiet car. No paparazzi, no flashing lights. Just the hum of the city beyond the glass. As the car rolled forward, Keanu let himself breathe. Then, almost unconsciously, he pulled the note out again. Read it one last time. I was wrong about you. About me. There was something raw in those words, something unfinished. Clara had left, but not in disgrace. She had made her choice, walked away before the world could shove her out. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't running this time. A vibration in his pocket pulled him back. A message from Sophia. They want a statement. About Clara. About you. About everything. You sure you want to stay silent? Keanu stared at the screen for a long moment. The internet was still shouting. The world still wanted its resolution. They wanted winners and losers. But life wasn't that clean. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, finally, he typed. No comment. Some things don't need a headline. He hit send. Leaned back. Closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd meet the kids. No cameras. No speeches. Just work. Just purpose. The world would keep spinning, keep shouting. But Keanu Reeves had already moved on.